Welcome. My name is Taylor Ward. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator with the Just Solutions Collective. The Just Solutions Collective is an organization that identifies and promotes just solutions to climate change for Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, and frontline diasporas, and provides informed analysis, reports, and more on the just solutions for the climate crisis that supports replication of community-developed, equitable, and just solutions, projects, and policies. Thank you all for joining us for the Let's Talk Mapping webinar, which we are hosting in collaboration with Front and Centered. This webinar will provide an overview of the Federal Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, which is to be used in Justice 40 funding dissemination. Our event will include presentations from Esther Min, who is the Director of Environmental Health Research Partnerships at Front and Centered, Alvaro Sanchez, who is the Vice President of Policy at the Green Lining Institute, and Sylvia Chi, who is the Senior Strategist at Just Solutions Collective. After presentations from Alvaro and Esther, we really want to hear from all of you, so we'll have time for questions and answers and discussion before Sylvia walks us through how to give public comment. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And yeah, again, thank you all for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Esther.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Taylor, can you let me know if you can see the screen that I'm sharing in presentation mode?
Yes, I can see the presentation mode.
Excellent. So I will give the quick overview of this federal tool that the Justice 40 or the Council on Environmental Quality in the White House has put out a beta version for, and currently seeking comments until the 25th of April through various different means. And so I will show you one way that you can give direct input, and we will also go over other ways to give feedback so we can perhaps write a collective letter together. So Front and Centered is a coalition of community organizations led by many people of color in Washington state, with more than 70 organizations within the state with diverse missions, but all coming together with the core mission of advancing environmental and climate justice. And so our approach is thinking about that intersection between equity, environmental, and climate justice through listening, educating, analyzing, creating, building influence, and thinking about policies. So I'll give a quick overview of this tool, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or as people have been calling it, CJUST. It is distinct from and different from the EJ screening tool that US EPA has, which they have recently uploaded their newest version with new data up in February of this year. This climate and economic justice screening tool, the intent seems to be to identify communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution, in the words of the folks that put this tool out. And so in order to be designated as a quote unquote disadvantaged community, the way that this methodology right now says that the community must be at or above a threshold for more than one or more of the 8 categories of criteria. For each of the criteria, they generally look like this, where there's one threshold around environmental or climate indicators. You have to be above wherever they draw the line in the sand. And you have to also be above the line in the sand, or that threshold, for the socioeconomic indicators. And it can vary depending on the indicators, but for the most part, looking at low income and educational attainment. And so of the 8 categories, I'll just quickly go through a handful and potentially suggest, areas where you might want to think about. So climate change, as the CEQ defines it, is expected agricultural loss rate, building loss rate, or population loss rate. Versus clean energy and energy efficiency, they have calculated it as 90th percentile for energy burden, or PM 2.5 in the air, or the particulate matter of air pollution in the air. For both of these, you have to qualify for this 90th percentile threshold plus 65th percentile for low income, and 80% or more of the adults 15 or older are not or have not been enrolled in higher education. And by their definition of low income, it's twice the amount of the federal poverty level, or 200% below the federal poverty level, which is one standard across the entire nation instead of adjusting for any regional median income or area household income, etc. They also have clean transit and affordable and sustainable housing as two other categories. Clean transit, the tool defines it as diesel particulate matter exposure and traffic proximity and volume. So if you're near a roadway and there's air pollution, that would qualify under the clean transit definition. And then affordable and sustainable housing is 90th percentile for lead paint, and median home value is at or less than 90th percentile, or at or above the 90th percentile for the housing cost burden. And so this is heavily, towards housing or the quality of housing with lead paint. Homes built prior to 1970s are very likely to have lead in the paint, and so that in the long run can cause harm to potential or increase your risk for children to be exposed. And so they have that indicator in there, and they also adjust it with the median home value and the housing cost burden for that affordability. Both of these categories, in order to be qualified to be a disadvantaged community, you also have to be 65th percentile for low income or above, or the low educational attainment for that community as well. Reduction and remediation of legacy pollution is also one, and this is one that I think many of the different environmental justice tools around the states are looking at or already have in there, which is proximity to hazardous waste sites or proximity to national priority list sites, which also you might have heard as Superfund sites, or proximity to risk management plan facilities or facilities that have certain chemicals that need to have a risk management plan in order to reduce the risk of exposure or community members getting into contact with whatever they have. And so that is how they define that legacy pollution. And they also have critical clean water and waste infrastructure, which they define as just the wastewater discharge that they're able to measure. And you have to be 90th percentile or above for that indicator. And for both of these, again, low income and educational attainment, you have to meet both of these conditions to be able to be a quote unquote disadvantaged community. Health burden, they define through asthma, diabetes, heart disease, or low life expectancy. And the line in the sand they draw is again 90th percentile. And for this, you also have to qualify with the low income and the educational attainment. Training and workforce development. This one's an interesting one because they define this one as low median income as a percentage of the area median income. So this is where they're adjusting for if you live in an urban center, the area median income might be higher or different from the federal poverty level, which is a different reference point, or linguistic isolation or unemployment, or percentage of individuals in a household that are at or below 100% of the federal poverty level. And in here, the socioeconomic conditions are different. So you have to meet one of the categories that I just talked about. So it's an or statement here. Plus, you have to have 10% or more of adults 25 or older that have not attained a high school degree, and 80% or more of adults 15 or older that are not enrolled in higher education. And so I wanted to quickly show you, if I can share, I will reshare my screen. I wanted to show you quickly on that tool how you might be able to search for your community, or how you might be able to navigate it. So in this landing page, when you go to that, it lands on this Explore the Tool page. And it shows up with the map here. I've zoomed into King County because that's where I am right now. And if you type in your zip code or some address or a city, it zooms you into the area that you're looking at, or that geography covers. And you might select a community on here or a census tract, and you'll see on the very right side that says identified as disadvantaged according to this tool. And for this community, it's a no. And so if you feel like, oh, you know what, why am I being left behind? Why is my community being left behind? One quick way is to press the send feedback button and talk about, why you feel like it should be included, or why you have been left behind before and shouldn't be this time. That is one quick way to give feedback. You can see here the different thresholds of why it didn't make that cut above the line in the sand. So for population loss rate, it is, above the threshold that they drew, but for the socioeconomic status, the low income level isn't as low as other communities when the reference is thinking about the federal poverty level or twice the federal poverty level. So you can look at all of these and look at the breakdown and see what might have had that community qualify more or less, or what didn't qualify you. And so this is one area you can give feedback, or you can actually also send feedback through this link here, which shows an email, and it will kind of pop up into whatever email you have on your computer for their screening tool support email as well. And I believe at the end of both of our conversations, we'll start talking about some of the feedback that we all might want to share together and collectively. So with that, I will hand it back over to you, Taylor.
Wonderful. Thank you, Esther, for that great presentation. While we wait for our next speaker to join, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. I know we all are aware that the map doesn't really include race as an indicator. So have you seen any other mapping used in other states that don't use race? And really, like, what made those maps successful that we can kind of keep in mind as we think about this map?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the huge criticisms of this tool is if you're trying to address systemic or environmental racism, but you don't use the word race in there, how can you actually do that? CalEnviroscreen, or California's screening tool for environmental justice or considering disadvantaged communities, in their words, and providing funding, they also do not have race as an indicator. They used to back in their older versions of 1.0, but currently on their 4.0 version, they do not have that. And I believe it is related to their the way that their state law is written around racial discrimination. Versus for Washington State, our Washington State Environmental Health Disparities Map, which is a similar tool that models California's. In our state, we actually do have race and ethnicity as an indicator, because for ours and the way our state law was written for I-200, the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General, through their interpretation, felt like it is okay to have in there. And since we're really trying to get and point out the drivers of these disparities and these risks, we were able to keep it in here. I believe it's I-200. And I think one of the state agencies, Department of Health, is working on getting a formal letter from the Attorney General's office explaining the reasons why that can be publicly available. And so we will definitely make sure to share that as well. In addition to, we have a webinar, I forget the date, so Taylor, you'll have to remind me, but we have a webinar together again on the Washington State Environmental Health Disparities Map that we can also go over that as well, if they come up with that letter by then.
Yes, that webinar is on May 4th, and so I'll be sure to send that out to everyone. Our next speaker is here, just trying to get his access to the webinar. Let's see. We have a question. How have tribal nations been captured in mapping?
That's a great question, and hi, Aiko. I think for different states or different regions, they would add language. So they will say, well, this is the map of the census tracts, and any boundaries or any census tracts that has overlap with any tribal nations or tribal boundaries, those should also be included in the different areas that get additional funding or whatnot. And of course, that's not enough. And I know tribes also have their own mapping tools, or the way that they even see environmental health disparities or environmental justice is very different too. And so there are also other tribal nations that have their own mapping tool as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Esther. And with that, we'll pass it over to Alvaro Sanchez from the Greenlining Institute to talk about policy implications.
Hi, thank you very much. And sorry to be joining a little bit late here, but thank you for the invitation to share. And yeah, policy implications of this mapping platform are really important. Ultimately, I think one of the things that I've been reminding a lot of the folks that I'm talking to about this platform is that this mapping platform ultimately is a tool. It's a tool to help us make decisions about how to implement something like the Justice 40 initiative. but it'll also be a tool that can help places that don't currently have mapping platforms that identify communities that are impacted by poverty and pollution to make decisions about how to alleviate that pain and also how to create new policy that uses the tool to make the case that these places need further assistance. So, I think that it's really important in this stage to be able to upgrade the tool to the best extent possible so that when it comes to implementation, we allow the implementation to really do the job of bringing more justice to these communities. So a couple of the points that I wanted to share is that based on the experience here in California, one of the policy implications of this tool is actually replicating the mechanism of targeting resources from different agencies to disadvantaged communities by setting the standard, in this case, with Justice 40. So what we've seen in California is that after SB 535, which was the bill here in California that both created the CalEnviro screen and set the minimum requirement for investments in disadvantaged communities, we've had a flurry of other pieces of legislation that uses the tool to make decisions around where to invest resources and has continued to increase the amount of funding that is targeted to those communities from the minimum threshold of 10% at the beginning, all the way to now, some mechanisms are using 50% of their revenue needing to be invested in these communities. So it really kind of just set the precedent and allow for additional policy to be built off of the beginning stage of this to be able to then be leveraged and increase the amount of revenue that is going to these places. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that another policy implication of a tool like this is that it does end up being used as a mechanism for a lot of different approaches, sometimes not the kind of approach that you may want to have to make decisions around the policy that you're advancing. So for example, there's been some criticism here in California around the use of CalEnviro screen to make decisions around public health and identify communities that are exposed to health impacts. This tool is not the perfect tool to make that kind of decision, but lacking other tools, it's used as kind of the next best case use. So at the national level, I think that's something that we'll have to kind of keep in mind, that what the CJUST tool is doing is identifying communities where we should prioritize climate action, but it's not always necessarily the best tool to use for other issue areas. But if there's no other tools that's available to you, I think it makes sense that some people look at it as a potential use to advance a policy priority on other topics that our communities are facing. So just a reflection from what's happened here in California, that's been one of the things that happens. Another policy implication of this tool is the fact that by designating certain communities as disadvantaged and others not, it does have the unintended consequence, I think, of those communities that are not seen as being a part of the tool, feeling left out of both the potential resources that are being made available through the tool or other policy actions that the tool might be bringing about. That's why I think it's really important, and it'll be part of our comments, to allow communities to have some type of mechanism to be able to make their case for why they should be a part of the tool when currently they are not. That's something that California has experimented with in this most recent iteration of CalEnviro screen, where there's been more ground truthing of what the tool is saying by the community residents and allowing them to make a case that the data sets are not quite available to prove that they are being disadvantaged, or that the tool is just not doing the job refined enough to be able to identify those communities. So allowing for some discretion to exist within the tool, it's a really important component so that at least there's an avenue to explore a community being designated disadvantaged if they feel like that is truly the case. I think we have to be conscious though of allowing this mechanism to be somewhat tailored and narrowly in scope so that it doesn't become something that just anybody can pursue. And it's something that is really tailored towards those communities that might really need that kind of mechanism. And the reason why this is important, of course, is because there are some benefits that are associated with being categorized as a disadvantaged community per these tools, whether it's new resources or new policy avenues that need to be explored. So that's really, really important. One aspect of the tool that I think is going to be interesting to see how it's done moving forward is outside of revenue distribution, what other opportunities there will be to use a tool like this for things like enforcement, actually. Cal Enviro Screening in California is actually used a lot for enforcement of policies that are meant to reduce pollution in community. So what the tool is telling us is where communities are heavily exposed to pollution, and Cal EPA and the Office of Health Hazard Assessment, they use the tool as an enforcement tool. And I think at the national level, I haven't yet seen as much of that information come to bear, but it is giving us a really good picture of where communities are being exposed. And I think paired with some policies that are in the books could be used as a way to enforce some of the existing policies that, that federally are available and also at the state level are available. And I think that this is kind of where I'll end, that for the communities that don't currently have any mapping mechanism, this is creating and really opening up a new kind of tool in the arsenal for communities that are fighting for healthier places to live, by having something available to them that is data-driven, that is used at the federal level, and that could be used at the local level because the tool is giving you that information. And make the case about why you need to have additional policies to address the pollution that people are facing. In California, I feel like Cal Enviro Screen proved that what community advocates and environmental justice communities had been saying for a really long time was indeed true, that communities were being overburdened and overpolluted, and these tended to be communities of color. So with the CJUST tool, I think there's going to be an opportunity for places that don't currently have those kinds of mechanisms, that don't have the capacity to be able to produce maps that demonstrate that impact, to now have something available to them, to really make the case and argue for stronger environmental protections, for additional resources, and for more attention to the impacts that their communities are facing. I'm really hopeful that these kinds of tools will allow more places to make the case that climate action is more needed, but that's still to be determined, of course, with how well the tool ultimately is making that case at a national level, but then also in the way that local jurisdictions are going to be able to use the tool to continue to advocate for stronger environmental protection laws and programs. So I think I'll pause there, and yeah, happy to take any questions, but this is a really important tool. I'm really excited about the potential, but again, I just want to close with the fact that at the end of the day, this is a tool. It's something that's helping us make decisions moving forward, and it's that process of using this tool to be able to open up new opportunities for environmental justice that's going to be really important. So the procedural equity that needs to follow is as important as the tool itself.
Thank you so much, Alvaro and Esther, for your presentations. Now we want to open it up to all of you to share any questions or concerns that you may have. So we're going to take like the next 20 minutes to do that and to discuss before we hear from Sylvia. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box, or you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can say your question out loud, whatever makes the most sense for you. So let's pull up these questions. So let's see. So someone asked if you could give another example, Alvaro, kind of about what you were talking about with the mapping and just another real world example that people can kind of see how the tool is useful for certain communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of examples I would say here in California about using the tool for charging infrastructure deployment. So when the investor-owned utilities were given the green light to develop proposals to spend money, ratepayer money, on the deployment of charging infrastructure, they use CalEnviroScreen as one of the mechanisms to identify where to make those investments related to where disadvantaged communities were. So they didn't do it out of their own good heart. It was a group of advocates saying, in the deployment of your resources, you have to commit a certain amount of charging infrastructure deployment to these communities. And again, the tool gave us the necessary information to make the case about why the investments needed to occur in those communities. And ultimately, in implementation, the investor-owned utilities used the tool to be able to make that determination about where those communities were. So that's another example of how this is being played out. Another example is, around the deployment of park funding. So there was a piece of legislation that passed, a park bond was achieved. And this is where, again, it gets a little complicated. The definition of disadvantaged community was somewhat different from what the tool itself was saying. But the tool nonetheless proved to be helpful in identifying some of these places where those funds could be deployed. And it was proven to be the case. I'll share one example where it's not working really well. So now there's a lot of concern around climate adaptation and resilience. And there's a lot of funding that's being made available to make investments in helping communities be more resilient to the effects of climate change. CalEnviroScreen tells us where communities are burdened by poverty and pollution. It doesn't, however, tell us where those communities are most at risk to the impacts of climate change. There's proxies to it, but it's not a perfect alignment. So now in California, we're developing a tool that allows us to identify communities that are impacted by the changing environment due to climate change, which will then help us make more targeted investments of resilience to those communities. So I just wanted to provide that as an example of where the tool doesn't do like everything that we would want the tool to do.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. And Esther, there's a question for you. Can you provide some information about how Washington State's tool kind of compares to CJUST and if there were any discrepancies between which communities were prioritized?
Yeah, and I'll put a link into the chat that just has a quick story so that you might be able to click around yourself. I made a map through my other hat and other role here and looked at just the difference of, who is considered or might be considered as overburdened according to the Washington State's tool. One note is that while California does specify this is the certain threshold who we will designate as disadvantaged community, for Washington State, they put that decision making to programs or whoever is actually using the tool. So they don't actually say it's a certain percentile or a certain number or what that is. There is a tool that is used, or there is a program through the Clean Energy Transformation Act here in Washington State, SB 5116 maybe. I'll get back to you all on that number. But on that, the Department of Health designated kind of the 9s and 10s or the top 20th percentile to be considered overburdened. And so any transition for utilities for clean energy and the co-benefits need to be intentionally shared while not sharing the unequal burden on those communities as well. And there is quite a bit of difference between who gets highlighted through the federal tool versus our state tool, among many reasons. One, we presume is actually because a race is not actually labeled there, and that will have an influence because your mapping tool is only as good as your data, and your data is only as good as what you put in there. And so because of that, there is an overlap, but it's about, I think, about half. So there is about half the communities that get highlighted from the Washington State specific tool that get picked up in the state's CJUST definition. And then there are the other half that isn't. So if you click into kind of King County, you can actually see for South King County, for Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map, it shows this larger geography, and that whole geography is considered to be highly impacted. Versus if you look at the federal CJUST tool, it kind of bifurcates, and so it divides that one chunk that the state's map identifies into half. And so it almost outlines, this one area and this other area, when we know that often disparities, right, don't have these artificial boundaries or borders. And some of that looks to be related to the threshold for that low income, especially for more urban centers, where even if your income might be slightly higher or higher than twice that poverty level, it's still not enough, right, to be self-sufficient, or it's some of these other factors, especially with transportation and housing cost. And so with that threshold, that seems to be disqualifying many of the communities from the federal toll. And thank you, Aiko, for clarifying. It is 5116.
Wonderful. Thank you, Esther. And Alvaro, there is another question for you. So in California, how is impact of deployment of funds measured? In your opinion, is mapping the right strategy for getting money to communities, or is there a better way?
Oh, that's a good question. So the way that it's measured is the state assigned the California Air Resources Board on developing methodologies to figure out what is the kind of the outcome associated with the investments that are being guided. And this is all cap and trade investments. So the primary methodology that's used is greenhouse gas reduction. So, that methodology had to be there from the beginning. But now they've developed other methodologies around, like, how do you measure job output, health outcomes, there's a bunch of methodologies that have been developed from the start. A big question mark was, how do you define benefit? And we fought over this definition for a long time because, as the Justice 40, executive order says, it's not investments having to specifically go into a community. It was the funding has to benefit the community. And the way you define that is really, really important. So in California, we were successful at getting the Air Resources Board to add 3 words to the definition of benefit. It has to be measurable, it has to be assured, and it has to be meaningful to the people that live in those communities. And I feel like that has really increased the way that we ultimately measure whether or not we're benefiting those populations. In California, the way that the mechanism works is that a minimum 25% of the revenue from cap and trade has to be located specifically in the disadvantaged community that's mapped. So the money has to be spent within the boundaries of that disadvantaged community. And then we do have a low income threshold, which is an additional 10% of the funding has to be spent on low income populations, 5% within a 5-mile radius of a disadvantaged community, half a mile radius, I'm sorry, not 5 mile, half a mile. And then the other 5% anywhere in the state that is only a low income designation. So is there a better way than a mapping platform to be able to identify where to make these investments? I think it has to be both the mapping platform, but the experience has proven that you do need to have a little bit of discretion. And I think for California, this is the low income discretion, because there are people who are really worthy of resources to invest in climate mitigation strategies that don't necessarily live in polluted communities. So by having this low income threshold, then you're able to make investments in renewable energy and building electrification and electric vehicle deployment for people that are low income that don't necessarily live in a disadvantaged community. And I think what we found here is that having low income folks gain access to the technology that helps fight climate change is important, maybe not as important as the priority of making the investments in communities that are polluted, but also really important. So then we created this additional kind of valve that is not so attached to a map, but more so attached to the, to the person or the family that could be eligible for these resources.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And Esther, we have a question kind of about what were the tools or the opportunities used to get community input. So do you have any idea on how community input was used to gain input on the development of the CJust tool?
Yeah, let me quickly show a graphic. So for Washington State Environmental Health Disparities Map, it was a 2-year-long process. And from a work group that was started by and directed by Front and Centered and aligning the goals and expectations with other partners, state agencies, academics, it started with listening sessions with community and asking them, what is their pollution burden and what is your vision of a healthy community and how do you get from A to B. And that was really captured and enshrined, knowing that it didn't cover the entire state or anything, but a good start to really start from community priorities and then look to what's available in the data and what more data needs to be built. Through lots of engagement and beta testing and analysis, about 2 years later, the map was released. Compared to that, for the C Justice federal tool, the beta was released in February of this year. And in between that and this 60-day request for information period, which is coming to a close in 2 Mondays from now, they're doing, I think, training sessions and listening sessions publicly. But as you can tell, the count isn't super high. I think they are adding on additional listening sessions as we speak. But there weren't really, prior to this February release tool, individuals or people within the staff of CEQ and other groups like the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and other places were being engaged, but there weren't really this process to solicit feedback and ask communities and go into communities and do that when they came up with this beta tool. And so it's a much more, I think, condensed framework and less of a process that really tried to work with communities because of various different factors and limitations.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then I guess I have a question for both of you. As people are starting to think about providing their own public comments, what are some things that you think people should keep in mind when they're thinking about their community, thinking about the people that they're serving as they're writing these public comments? Are there any specific asks that they should make as they outline these things?
Do you want to go first, Salvador? I think it's really important to share the reasons why you feel like your community shouldn't be left behind in that text. The CEQ has at least verbally committed through these different conversations that have been public that they will really pay attention to the comments coming in, the census tracts, or the communities where you label, you know what, I'm not currently qualified in the disadvantaged definition, but I should be. These are reasons why. They're at least saying that they will try and really read those and make sure to reflect that in this beta mode, but not entirely sure how long it's going to take them to then start considering it final and then start pushing out funding. And so I think the more detail you can provide or really say or give examples, I think that will really give a lot more to consider. If you have any other suggestions, like any reports that your organization has done or any existing experience or things that you have already compiled, not to do additional work, but what you have already done, referencing those, putting those links in there and really having them study what you have already done so they're not starting new, but also not making you do new things. I think that would also be super helpful too for the feedback.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to say in terms of recommendations, but a couple that I think really stand out. I think race has to be included in the tool in one way or another. Okay, fine. Maybe it's really risky to add race because it opens up to lawsuits, but they should at least try. And even if it's not ultimately used as a consideration, like as an actual, a category, having the ability to like turn on a race filter in the tool, which is something that in California we do, at least gives you more information. And again, it could be applied for other things. So just making sure that we all collectively say that it's an important factor that needs to be included in the tool to an extent will be really important. Another thing too, I think is, again, Greenlighting does a lot of work around algorithmic bias. And this tool is heavily reliant on data sets. And some data sets here are not really capturing the accurate information on the ground. So allowing for some discretion in the tool, I think, is appropriate, because we know that, we just learned, right, that there was severe undercounting in the census when it came to Black folks and Latino folks. So kind of bringing that up and saying like data sets are not, while it's fact and it's data, it really depends on how it was collected and what like the strength of that data. So having an opportunity to have more ground truthing of the data, I think is going to be something important. And attached to that is really just the engagement process in continuing to develop this tool. And a recommendation that we're giving is there has to be concrete kind of timeline and process for updating the tool. If the tool is relying on data, when is that data going to be upgraded? What process are they going to go through to making the upgrades necessary to the tool? And in that process, how are they going to engage with the public around doing this? Because my experience in the development of this tool was that they didn't do a really good job engaging even folks who are really plugged into this conversation. So moving forward, that needs to get much better. And we need to know when it's going to happen and how they're going to go about doing the upgrades, because that'll give us an opportunity to continue to refine and improve the tool. So those three I would suggest.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for answering those questions. We have one more question in the Q&A box that we'll get to, and then we'll wrap up and pass it on to Sylvia. This last question is about race again. So, can race be included via the demonstrated health stresses of racism? That is, a socioeconomic factor demonstrated to impact health negatively. It seems to me that the only way to do it would be to look at a fraction of the BIPOC population in the community. Any thoughts on that?
That's a great idea and a great suggestion. And I think, one of the ways, if race itself can't be added, what are the other proxy measures, or what are the other measures or metrics we can add in there that still represents the disparities that have really happened through environmental racism? And so I think, that's a great idea that hoping people will suggest to them. And also when we collect it too, that's something that we can perhaps highlight as well.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And thank you everyone for your questions. So we're going to wrap up this period just to make sure there's enough time to learn about how we're going to be providing our comments. So if you have any other questions, feel free to keep putting them in the Q&A box. And if we have time at the end, we'll get to them. If not, we'll follow up with you and be happy to answer your questions. And so with that, I will pass it over to Sylvia Chi, who will talk a little bit more about next steps.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining today. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot. I hope you did too. I'm just going to walk through a couple of the different ways to provide feedback to the CEQ about this tool. As was mentioned, they're taking comments until April 25th, and there's a few different ways you can do that. So there is a more formal process. Would be by providing written comments in response to the request for information that they published. And I just pasted the link in the chat that shows where you can do that. And that provides some instructions as to how they want to receive those comments. But basically it's pretty open-ended, and basically you can write a letter and they will take that into consideration. And I should mention also that we are developing a primer document that should be ready soon, and we can share that resource in the follow-up to this webinar that provides some kind of bullet points of some of the issues that were mentioned in this webinar, so that can help inform any comments, written comments that you might want to submit. So that's the more formal route. If you go to the CJust website, there's a couple other ways to submit feedback as well. I will try to share my screen to kind of walk through it. Oops. Okay. So if you see, on the CJust website, there's a few different ways. First, there is a listening session. They've done a bunch of training sessions already, and they've done one listening session. There's one more listening session that hasn't happened yet. That's on April 15th. So you can register for that and talk to them at that session and provide your feedback. They also have a YouTube recording for the training sessions if you haven't seen that yet. They just have an email address here that you can just send them an email and provide your feedback through that. And there's also a survey. So this survey is pretty easy to fill out. So if you don't have time to write out comments, this might be a quicker way to do that. And if you are looking at your map or your neighborhood and you're seeing, you know, that your neighborhood is not highlighted by the map, but you think it is, there's a button right in the tool that says you can provide feedback and say, you know, why you think that your census tract should be included as well. So for all of these different ways to provide feedback, the only one that has the formal deadline is April 25th is the response to the request for information. But I would recommend getting in the other feedback before then as well. So that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sylvia. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And we hope that this was really helpful as you prepare to give your comments on this map and this tool. I wanted to share some next steps. So we will be sharing, as Sylvia mentioned, a follow-up email with some more resources on how you can provide your feedback. And if you have questions while doing so, feel free to reach out to us and you can just reply directly to that email and we'll get back to you. We also have a post-event survey, so if you could fill that out, that'd be very helpful for us so we can keep planning events like this in the future. But yeah, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our speakers for being here, answering questions, and giving their feedback. And so I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we will be in touch soon. Have a wonderful day.